Welcome back, everyone. A whirlwind of significant events is shaking the globe, and we are here to break it all down for you. From geopolitical shifts to major economic tremors, the world stage is incredibly active right now. We will be diving into several key developments today, but the standout piece of news, the one generating considerable buzz, concerns international trade and a potential major realignment. According to recent reports, specifically citing the U.S. National Economic Council director, over 50 countries have formally reached out to former President Trump's team to initiate negotiations on new trade deals. This isn't just a minor headline, it represents a potential seismic shift in global trade dynamics, signaling that nations worldwide are already preparing for a possible shift in U.S. trade policy and acknowledging the substantial leverage the United States wields. Before we delve into the intricate details of what this means for the global economy, the specific nations involved, and the potential ripple effects on markets and international relations, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and ring the notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analyses. Your engagement is crucial for helping our channel grow and allows us to continue bringing you these vital updates. Also, let us know in the comments section where you are tuning in from. We love hearing from our global audience. We will be exploring the historical context, the economic theories at play, and the possible future scenarios stemming from this development. Stick around until the very end, as we will be synthesizing all this information and offering our key conclusions on what this truly signifies. The report itself, originating from sources like the United States Trade Representative, USTR, and confirmed by the National Economic Council Director, indicates a significant volume of diplomatic outreach. More than 50 nations approaching a former and potentially future president to discuss trade frameworks is unprecedented and speaks volumes. It directly counters a narrative often pushed by some commentators. The idea that if the U.S. imposes tariffs or adopts a more protectionist stance, the rest of the world will simply pivot and increase trade with other major economies, primarily China. This development suggests that calculation is far too simplistic. Why aren't these 50-plus countries flocking exclusively to Beijing? The answer lies in the unique and frankly irreplaceable position of the American consumer and the overall might of the U.S. economy. You simply cannot replicate the purchasing power and market access that the United States offers. Think about the sheer scale. The U.S. possesses an enormous consumer base with high disposable income compared to many other parts of the world. Data consistently shows the U.S. as the world's largest importer, creating massive demand for goods produced globally. Look at the trade deficits the U.S. runs with numerous countries. While often framed negatively, these deficits underscore how reliant many nations are on selling their products within the American market. They need access to American wallets. Replacing that level of demand is not a matter of simply signing a deal with China or the European Union. China, while a huge economy, has a different economic structure, and its domestic consumption, though growing, doesn't absorb imports on the same scale or across the same range of products as the U.S. The EU is a large bloc, but it's fragmented and also employs its own set of trade barriers, like value-added taxes, VAT, which can make imports less competitive. Therefore, the notion that these 50 countries can just bypass the U.S. market is proving to be a fallacy. They recognize the inherent economic gravity of the United States, and that's why they are initiating these conversations proactively. This inherent power, this economic gravity, is precisely why the U.S. maintains significant leverage in trade negotiations, a point we knew was likely to surface. And remember, be sure to watch this video until the conclusion for our final analysis. This leverage stems not just from the size of the consumer market, but also from the depth and sophistication of the U.S. economy. Consider the sheer number of companies headquartered in the U.S., the innovation hubs, the financial markets. It is an ecosystem that fuels global commerce. When the U.S. decides to adjust its trade policies, whether through broad tariffs or targeted measures, the effects reverberate globally. We saw this during President Trump's first term. His administration implemented tariffs on goods like steel and aluminum, and while the long-term effectiveness is debated, it undeniably forced countries to the negotiating table. The current situation, with over 50 countries reaching out, demonstrates a clear understanding of this dynamic. They anticipate potential changes and want to secure favorable terms, or at least mitigate potential negative impacts. This isn't just about traditional tariffs either. The European Union, for example, often utilizes value-added taxes, VAT, and complex regulatory standards that can act as non-tariff barriers, making it harder for U.S. goods to compete in their markets. Trump's approach often involved highlighting these imbalances and demanding reciprocity. If you tax our goods heavily, expect similar treatment. There was even the somewhat ridiculed instance of tariffs potentially applying to seemingly insignificant locations, like islands populated mainly by penguins. While sounding absurd on the surface, the underlying point was about closing loopholes. Countries can sometimes use third-party locations or territories for transshipment, routing goods through them to disguise their origin and avoid tariffs. Implementing broad, even seemingly universal tariffs can be argued as a necessary, albeit blunt, instrument to prevent such manipulation and ensure the intended economic pressure is applied. These countries reaching out understand this complex game. They know that simply complaining about U.S. tariffs while maintaining their own barriers isn't a sustainable strategy when dealing with an administration focused on reciprocity and leverage. The very act of these 50-plus nations initiating contact underscores the power dynamic. They are reacting to the potential return of a specific U.S. trade posture, proving that the U.S. market remains the ultimate prize in global trade, and access to it is paramount. The immediate reaction in the financial markets to the prospect of widespread tariffs often reflects uncertainty and potential disruption. We might see stock market downturns, like the visualizations of red across trading screens suggest. This happens because tariffs can increase costs for businesses that rely on imported components or sell goods internationally, and investors dislike unpredictability. However, it's crucial to analyze this beyond the initial knee-jerk reaction. Many analysts, including those cited in reports, argue that this is anticipated short-term turbulence. The narrative, often amplified by critics, that tariffs translate directly into massive price hikes for consumers, like the frequently debunked claim of a $4,000 or $5,000 cost increase per family, is overly simplistic. Economic reality is more complex. The actual cost burden depends heavily on factors like supply elasticity, how easily producers can find alternative markets or absorb costs. Often, the exporting country's producers bear a significant portion of the tariff cost, or companies adjust their profit margins rather than passing the full amount onto consumers. So, who feels the most immediate impact of market volatility driven by tariff news? Primarily, it is those with significant investments in the stock market. Large institutional investors and wealthier individuals whose net worth is tied to portfolio performance. This contrasts sharply with the concerns of many average citizens, particularly younger generations, who are often more preoccupied with tangible issues like the skyrocketing cost of housing, stagnant real wages relative to inflation, and overall affordability. While tariffs can influence prices, the argument is that the systemic issues causing widespread financial strain for working families are often deeper and existed long before recent tariff discussions. Therefore, framing the tariff debate solely around immediate consumer price hikes misses the larger picture of who bears the brunt of market fluctuations versus who is struggling with fundamental economic pressures like housing affordability. This expected market dip, while concerning for investors, is viewed by proponents of the tariff strategy as a necessary, temporary cost for achieving a more fundamental, long-term economic rebalancing. This potential wave of negotiations, initiated by over 50 countries, signifies more than just adjustments to existing agreements. It points towards a broader, global reset of trade practices. For decades, the global trade system evolved under a framework that, critics argue, allowed certain countries to benefit disproportionately, often at the expense of American manufacturing and jobs, facilitated by agreements perceived as unbalanced. Trump's tariff strategy, in this view, acts as a catalyst forcing a reevaluation of these long-standing arrangements. We are already seeing hints of where this might lead. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, itself a renegotiation of NAFTA driven by the previous Trump administration, is likely up for review, potentially influenced by the outcomes of upcoming elections, like the one anticipated in Canada. Beyond North America, deals with key partners are also in the spotlight. Vietnam, which benefited significantly as companies shifted supply chains away from China, is reportedly engaged in talks. Israel and India, both strategic partners with growing economic ties to the U.S., are also part of this renegotiation landscape. The United Kingdom, navigating its post-Brexit trade reality, is another crucial player seeking to define its relationship with the U.S. market. The fact that such a large and diverse group of nations, potentially including major Asian economies like South Korea and Taiwan, alongside nations in South America and elsewhere, are proactively seeking dialogue suggests a widespread acknowledgement that the status quo might not hold. What changes could emerge from these renegotiations? Possibilities include demands for stronger enforcement of labor and environmental standards, measures aimed at reducing bilateral trade deficits, stricter rules of origin to prevent transshipment, and a greater emphasis on overall reciprocity and market access. This isn't merely about tweaking percentages on tariff schedules. It's about fundamentally reshaping the rules of engagement to prioritize what the proponents see as fairer, more balanced trade that supports American economic interests and potentially encourages a return of domestic production. This potential global reset, triggered by the assertion of U.S. economic leverage, aims to shift the focus from unfettered globalization to a system perceived as more equitable for American workers and industries. The push for renegotiated trade deals ties directly into a core objective, often articulated by proponents of this strategy: revitalizing domestic production within the United States. The argument is that decades of prioritizing cheap imports led to the hollowing out of American manufacturing, loss of well-paying jobs, and over-reliance on potentially unstable foreign supply chains. Tariffs, particularly broad ones or strategically high ones like the potential 25% tariff on automotive imports mentioned in discussions, are seen as a powerful tool to incentivize companies to relocate production back to the U.S. or source more components domestically. This strategy aligns with broader arguments about economic nationalism, self-sufficiency, and even national security, suggesting that critical industries should not be overly dependent on foreign nations, especially potential adversaries. Reports also suggest that in a potential second term, President Trump might rely on a more focused group of advisors who share this vision, potentially leading to an even more assertive and less conventional approach to trade and economic policy compared to his first term. Furthermore, the revenue generated from these tariffs, which could potentially amount to hundreds of billions of dollars annually depending on the scope and rates, presents another layer to the strategy. This revenue stream could theoretically be used to offset other tax cuts aimed at boosting the domestic economy or providing relief to American workers. Concepts floated include eliminating federal taxes on tips for service workers or potentially exempting overtime pay from taxation. While the feasibility and economic impact of such specific tax cuts are complex and debatable, the potential link between tariff revenue and domestic tax relief adds a political dimension to the trade strategy. It allows proponents to frame tariffs not just as a defensive measure against unfair trade, but as a mechanism to fund pro-worker policies domestically. This intertwining of trade policy, domestic manufacturing incentives, and potential tax adjustments forms a comprehensive vision aimed at fundamentally altering the U.S. economic landscape, shifting the balance away from reliance on imports and towards greater domestic economic strength. The implementation of broad tariffs and the subsequent global reaction inevitably intersect with the policies of the Federal Reserve. Currently, the Fed under Jerome Powell is grappling with relatively high interest rates compared to recent history, trying to manage inflation that, while lower than its peak, remains persistent in certain sectors. Trump has historically been very critical of the Fed's decisions, particularly regarding interest rate hikes, often favoring lower rates to stimulate economic activity. A scenario involving widespread new tariffs introduces significant complexity. On one hand, tariffs can be inflationary by raising the cost of imported goods. On the other hand, the potential economic slowdown or market disruption caused by these tariffs could pressure the Fed to cut interest rates more quickly or deeply than they otherwise might. This creates a potential counterbalance. Tariff-induced price increases could be partially offset by lower borrowing costs resulting from Fed rate cuts. This dynamic sets the stage for a potential clash, or at least significant tension between the administration's trade policy and the central bank's monetary policy objectives. It is a very different scenario than the one under the Biden administration, which, while dealing with inflation, has largely operated with a more traditional, less confrontational relationship with the Fed. Moreover, the focus shifts the debate around economic health. While the Biden administration often highlights metrics like low unemployment and total job creation, critics, aligning with the tariff proponents' arguments, point to the quality of those jobs. They argue that many jobs created were low-wage, part-time positions, or simply people returning to work post-pandemic restrictions, often needing second or third jobs to cope with inflation, particularly in essential costs like housing. The tariff strategy, therefore, is presented not just as a trade tool, but as part of a larger effort to foster higher quality, better-paying domestic jobs, even if it involves challenging the Fed's traditional approach and accepting some initial economic friction. Putting all these intricate elements together, the global outreach, the assertion of U.S. leverage, the market reactions, the domestic production goals, and the complex interplay with monetary policy, allows us to form some key conclusions. So, as we wrap up this analysis, let's crystallize the main takeaways from this significant development, where over 50 nations are seeking trade talks with President Trump's team. First and foremost, this confirms the immense and perhaps underestimated economic leverage the United States continues to hold on the global stage. The idea that the world can easily decouple from the U.S. market appears to be more theoretical than practical. Access to the American consumer remains a primary driver for economies worldwide. Consequently, the narrative that countries would simply pivot to China or other blocs in the face of U.S. tariffs is being challenged by this reality. Secondly, the expected short-term market volatility resulting from potential tariff implementations is a predictable consequence of uncertainty. However, the argument that this pain disproportionately affects average consumers is debatable. The immediate impact is often felt more acutely by large asset holders, while broader economic pressures like housing costs remain dominant concerns for many. Third, these potential tariffs and the ensuing negotiations should be viewed as part of a larger strategy aimed at resetting global trade norms, moving away from perceived imbalances and towards a system emphasizing reciprocity and potentially boosting domestic production. This involves specific renegotiations with key partners like Canada, Mexico, Vietnam, India, and the UK, and potentially many others among the 50-plus nations reaching out. Fourth, this trade strategy is deeply intertwined with domestic economic goals, including revitalizing American manufacturing and potentially funding tax relief for workers through tariff revenue, creating a complex interplay between international trade and national policy. Finally, the entire situation forces a reevaluation of the relationship between fiscal trade policy and monetary policy, potentially leading to significant shifts in how the Federal Reserve operates, especially concerning interest rates, in the face of assertive trade actions. In essence, we are witnessing the powerful assertion of U.S. economic influence, forcing a global recalculation, a process involving short-term disruption, but aimed at achieving a long-term economic structure proponents believe will be more favorable to American interests. Thank you for watching this analysis through to the end. It is a complex issue with many moving parts, and understanding these dynamics is crucial. If you found this breakdown insightful and valuable, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel for more content like this, and perhaps sharing the video with others who might be interested. We encourage you to leave your thoughts and perspectives in the comments section below. Constructive discussion helps everyone gain a deeper understanding. Your engagement truly fuels our channel. Thanks again for tuning in.